My name's Jeff Marqusee. I work at the Department of Defense in the Office of Secretary of Defense, where I manage our installation and environment technology programs, which include energy issues, which are of growing importance for us. What we want to really try to do today is have a conversation with you to try to illustrate and discuss some of the issues if you're trying to move from the world of ARPA-E to the world of DoD. They are culturally very different worlds. The business practices are quite different, and if you're not aware of that, I think you'll have some hiccups along the way. So what I'd like to do just briefly is sort of set the stage first, and then have people who are sitting to my left here give you some of their perspectives and their experience and some of their insights into the processes of working with the Department of Defense. What are some of the barriers? What are some of the things you need to understand? And we want to leave enough time for people to have questions and to really try to have a dialogue on this. Because my experience has been that, ARPA-E represents an enormous source of innovation that the Department of Defense can and wants to exploit, but it's not going to happen seamlessly unless we think hard and partner early. These things are not easy to do. For those of you who have not worked with DoD, trust me, it's the largest bureaucracy ever imagined in human history, and any bureaucracy that big has some troubles in working with it. But let me set the stage first and just make sure you understand what our interest in DoD is and where we come from. I'm sure you've heard said often that Department of Defense uses more energy than any other institution in the world. Much of the focus has been on what we call operational energy, which is really the use of fuel. That tends to get a lot of press, particularly biofuel issues. But what we want to focus on today is the infrastructure side of the Department of Defense, what we call installation energy. And that's the issues my programs and my office are concerned with. This is still a significant use of energy. It represents over $4 billion a year of direct payment by the Department of Defense to power our fixed installations. These installations exist predominantly in the U.S., but are worldwide. We have over 500 fixed installations around the globe. On those installations, we have over 300,000 buildings, roughly 2 billion square feet of space. So it's just the sheer size of it which drives that number of $4 billion a year. The Department of Defense in our installation world is extremely interested in innovation in the energy space, primarily for two reasons. One is straightforward economics. The Department of Defense is under continued pressure as its budgets go down to operate more efficiently, and $4 billion plus a year is a significant amount of money even for the department. And we need to find a way to lower that. When we look at our opportunities to reduce our energy intensity, to reduce our total energy usage, there are lots of technologies which are certainly valuable out there. But if we're going to change it at the level of 50 to 70% for existing buildings, it's not going to happen by using existing standard commercial technologies. It's going to happen, we believe, by grabbing innovation from places like ARPA-E and other organizations and moving it into the Department of Defense. So that, as I said, the first reason we're interested is pure economics. The second reason is security. I mean, we don't use energy just for the sake of energy, obviously. We do it to conduct our missions. The Department of Defense installations, these 300,000 buildings, represent a diverse array of activities. We have ongoing operations that are fixed installations, flying drones, doing intelligence, data processing, which have to operate always and with backup power. At the same time, we operate a huge number of industrial facilities, shipyards, aircraft depots. We operate complex and large R&D facilities. And as anyone who's been involved in the industrial sector knows, any disruption of that energy has a huge cost, has a mission cost, has an economic cost, has a cost in your ability to be an effective organization. So besides the economic driver to reduce our costs in the long term, we need to be more resilient. We need to be able to manage our energy in a way which could sustain natural disasters, cyber attacks, unintended consequences that we probably don't even know about right now. So those are the drivers, and those drivers lead to what I and my office believe is a big opportunity for people doing innovation in the energy space. There are really no comparable markets that aggregate that demand under one organization. But having said it's under one organization, you have to recognize it's a very distributed organization. 500 installations aren't centrally managed from one office. There are 3 services, 4 services to count the Marine Corps, and they each have their own programs. And so it is complex to deal with the Department of Defense. One of the things, though, that we recognized early on was that technology wasn't going to jump from a proof of concept, a leap ahead effort that might have been funded by ARPA-E out to an installation in the middle of the country. So one of the things my office established, and some of the people on this panel have been engaged with our program, was a thing called the Installation Energy Test Bed under one of my programs, the Environmental Security Technology Certification Program. And so we are actively trying to both reach back to innovative technologies and serve as a bridge to the ultimate deployment. And we can come back, and I'm happy to answer any questions about that and what's going on there. But what I'd like to do now is walk through the different panel members here, give them each an opportunity, talk a little about where they come from, and talk about some of their lessons they've learned in trying to work, particularly in the energy space, but specifically with the Department of Defense. And so we're going to each talk for a few minutes, hopefully have enough time to answer any of your questions during the session. So what I'd first like to do is introduce Mike West, who's 2 to my left here. Mike is the Chief Executive Officer of Advantek Consulting Engineering. They've been involved in very innovative HVAC technologies. They're engaged in one of the programs my office runs. And let him give you his perspective as a small business, as an innovator, on how it is to work with the Department of Defense. Mike?
Okay, thanks, Jeff. Good afternoon. I'm Mike West, Principal CEO of Advantek Consulting. Climostat is an energy technology that we've been developing since about year 2000. I'll just give you a little background first, and then I'll give you some differences between contracting with DOE and other federal agencies and with DoD. Climostat is an air conditioning technology that improves the energy efficiency of self-contained cooling units, essentially more cooling and dehumidification for less power. We've heard the first patent was in 2002, and between 2002 and 2007, our R&D was supported by various DOE and state grants, up to our first commercial applications in 2007. At that time, we chose to focus on commercial sector markets because the market entry costs were lower and more manageable for a small business than it would be for trying to break into the government sector. However, after working on that for a couple of years, we concluded that the commercial air conditioning sector is moribund. That's a term that one of my colleagues came up with for the way it moves very slowly. And it is notoriously slow to adopt new technologies. So we kept at it, but it was moving slowly. In 2009, we learned of the DoD's ESTCP program that Jeff was talking about that accelerates the adoption of cutting-edge energy technologies. And at that time, my company made a decision to commit the time and resources to apply for the program. Now, here's one difference between a small company and a big company in terms of applying for funding from a program like ESTCP. That for us, that's a major investment of time and resources relative to, our everyday operations. Whereas a larger corporation could easily spare 2 or 3 people for a month or so to get something like that done. So anyway, it was a big commitment, and we're glad we did it because with ESTCP's support, we were able to set up demonstrations at 2 military bases, which are nearly complete. And from that, we've already have interest from 2 other bases that are considering Climostat, and a nice little spot on their website. It's working out really well. Thanks, Jeff. We're really thankful for the ESTCP program. Our experience working with military applications differs from our commercial sector work in 3 basic ways. First, our work with DOE, Department of Energy, was not as an end-use customer. Our DOE funding was for research and development. With DOD, the first thing we noticed is that the military, our customer, is actually the end-use client. Those are the personnel that would actually be deploying, maintaining, and using our technology. So the ESTCP program, understandably, is extremely rigorous. It's designed to uncover and address any and all weaknesses in the technology. In some cases, lives can be put at risk if the technology fails, and this is not the case in other applications that we had experience with. Second, even DoD, even for a federal agency, is an extremely large organization that's used to dealing with very large corporations. The contracting requirements are onerous. Fortunately for us, our accounting system was mostly FAR compliant after having worked with DOE for several years, and we had already approved costing rates in place. So that helped a lot to get things moving. To further streamline the contracting process, what we did is propose a type of fixed cost arrangement that was still open book, but could not exceed the proposed amount. And finally, as a small business, what we think we offer is a very high value. We're flexible, and we're used to working outside the box on a daily basis relative to large organizations. So as we move on, I welcome any questions you have related to small business and our experiences. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Mike. I think we'll hold questions until everyone's talked and then hopefully have a conversation. I'd like to introduce Rodney from Deloitte Financial Advisory Services. He's the Director of Financial Advisory Services there, and I think he'll help you understand some of the critical issues associated with actually doing work under contracts with the Department of Defense as opposed to a grant-oriented organization, which many of the DOE programs are.
Okay. Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate that. Just by way of context, I've been with Deloitte since '84, working with companies on compliance, and prior to that was with the Defense Contract Audit Agency for almost 9 years. So I've been on both sides, seen both perspectives. We have a short time here. I'm going to get right to it. I'm talking about cost and pricing issues. So for any of you that are particularly interested in the concept of a pre-award accounting system review. In other words, if you're moving out of the grant world and moving into the defense contracting world, and you have an opportunity to step up, especially to a cost reimbursement contract or a time material contract, or submitting some type of cost proposal, even on a fixed price, you may find yourself on the receiving end of an audit by someone like the Defense Contract Audit Agency. And they're going to go right to the heart of the matter in terms of certain types of criteria that your system has to comply with. And I want to emphasize that the need and the importance of this is that it is a precondition to contracting when it applies. If you don't have an approved accounting system and you find yourself stepping into this world, you won't be responsive to the procurement, and you may not be able to continue in the competition. So it's something, if this is of interest to you, I'm going to go through 6 major points rather quick. I'm going to give you some references as to where it is in the FAR, and so this is an educational process as it relates if you're interested in this topic. 6 areas. Number 1, if you want to get yourself set up the right way to do some defense contracts, you've got to think about your integrity and ethical values. You've got to have an overall control environment and a system where you have written codes of ethics and conduct and related training. And I emphasize that you need to have this in the context of government contracting. You know, every commercial corporation has some sort of ethical values, but you need to tie these to the special requirements of government contracting. And where are you going to look for that? You're going to look, here's your first point of reference, to FAR Part 3. Federal Acquisition Regulation Part 3 is going to tell you a lot about business practices and what you need to stand up to for procurement integrity and organizational conflicts of interest and things like the False Claims Act. This is where you want to put some focus in terms of the special requirements around these types of topics. Secondly, and to the heart of the matter, the accounting system. There's different aspects of standing up an accounting system. At the bare bones, the basic block and tackling to stand up to a cost reimbursement contract is found in Part 53 of the FAR, where the forms are. You look for the form, the 1408. The 1408 is a pre-award accounting system survey form. It's going to be exactly what DCAA audits do. They're going to look for things like an established direct and indirect cost structure. They're going to look for things like your ability to identify unallowable cost. And those cost principles that apply to you are going to depend on the institution that you are. For example, if you're a higher education institution, you're going to find the cost principles, as you know, in OMB Circular A120, A21. If you're a nonprofit, it's A122. If you're a for-profit, it's going to be the Federal Acquisition Regulation, FAR Part 31. But you've got to have an established structure for direct and indirect. You've got to be able to identify unallowable cost, and you probably have got to have a time reporting system. And so a lot of times this turns out to be a challenge for folks that don't have a robust, auditable time reporting system, to be able to do ultimately some form of project accounting. That's around what the essentials are around accounting. As you grow and get larger, you may have other types of requirements that come in, some referred to as the cost accounting standards. But don't get confused. The cost accounting standards are a whole different set of rules and regulations that are incremental to the basic block and tackling around a pre-award accounting system survey, which I just referred to. They are incremental requirements. As you get bigger, they may or may not apply. And so that's very relevant as well. Thirdly, the estimating system. Of the 6 that I want to highlight. The estimating system, you want to look to FAR Part 15 in negotiated contracts. And a couple of things that I want to emphasize here is today, particularly in the issues of dealing with the folks like DCAA, if you're going to submit a cost proposal, if you're going to submit certified cost or pricing data, if you're going to sign up to something called the Truth in Negotiations Act, you have got to properly document your cost proposal. If you look in FAR Part 15, point 408, Table 15-2, Table 15-2 is what tells you exactly what you need to do to have a documented, audited cost proposal to be responsive to a proposal. That is absolutely critical from an estimating perspective. You've got to have processes as well before you certify the cost of pricing data to comply with the Truth in Negotiations Act. That's another critical element. Fourthly, the billing system. The billing system is absolutely essential, particularly in a cost reimbursement or time and material contract, because here the heart of the matter is in complying with the specific contract terms and conditions that tell you, one, the level of detail in which you must accumulate cost and bill cost. You've got to follow the contract. The layers of detail you need for billing as well. Also in terms of different types of notices to the government, particularly around when you anticipate an overrun. This is a separate billing contract clause called the limitation of cost and the limitation of funds clause. So issues around following your contract and the level of detail, having sufficient documentation to support the cost, because I'll tell you today, DCAA is all over documentation. If you don't have the right level of documentation, they're not going to accept the cost. So you've got to have that for billing purposes, and you've got to comply with those terms and conditions. Fifthly, purchasing. Purchasing is another critical business system. You'll find a lot of discussion in the purchasing system in Part 44 of the FAR. And in that regard, obviously the emphasis is a lot on competitive pricing, sole source justification, what it's applicable, having the documentation around that. Secondly, the flow down of contract clauses. You've got to make sure that your purchasing system is set up to be able to flow down the right FAR clauses for the right types of subcontract terms and conditions. If it's fixed price, if it's commercial item, if it's cost plus, it's all going to have a different set of terms and conditions that need to get flowed down. That'll not only protect you, but it also protects the government for the FAR flow down. And finally, the players. When you're dealing in this area of cost and pricing data, who are the players? Well, I've already mentioned one, the auditors, particularly in the Defense Department, it's going to be the Defense Contract Audit Agency. And today, DCAA has sort of a whole new world view of how they do audits. They're very much by the book. So the things that I've been outlining here today, you really need to pay attention to. Obviously, there's the procuring contracting officer and the contracting officer's technical representative. The only thing I want to leave you with here in terms of importance in particular is that the contracting officer is the one with the authority around setting up and executing the contract and making modifications and changes. The Kotar, or the contracting officer technical representative, gives technical guidance in the field, but typically does not have authority to modify the contract. You've got to be very careful in the defense contracting arena not to take orders from the Kotar that are outside the contract terms and conditions when they don't have the authority other than telling you technical direction to do that. That's an important takeaway. And frankly, these are and one other party, a key party, is the Administrative Contracting Officer, the ACO. They have authority around things like indirect rates, compliance with your business systems, and those kinds of things. All of these are the key players that you deal with in the defense contracting arena in making decisions about audit oversight, about compliance on your contract, about performance on your contract, and the like. And in a summary, these are really critical elements. There's a whole lot more behind this, obviously, but they are critical elements to success in the defense contracting arena on cost and pricing matters.
Thanks a lot, Rodney. I want to turn now to Deborah Jelen, who's the Executive Director of Electricore. Electricore is a nonprofit which has worked with both small businesses and the Department of Defense for quite a few years successfully, and I think she can give you some perspective from sitting between those in some sense on some of the issues and challenges.
Thank you and good afternoon. So I'm an executive director of a nonprofit corporation, but I've spent the bulk of my career developing and transitioning products into the aerospace, military, and also automotive world. And so I've lived through this cycle and felt the pain. Electricore, not-for-profit, set up by DARPA back in 1993. And what we do is build teams strategically to take technology through research, development, and demonstration. We use this teaming to create balanced teams of industry, both small and large, universities, national laboratories, and even the government, so that we can focus on attacking very tough technology problems. We think that the team method is really important because it allows each of the team members to focus on their area of excellence and be augmented in areas where they may not have as many strengths. And the other thing that it does is it reduces the risk, both perceived and real, for the sponsor of the funding, because these agencies only have a chance to select one or two teams to move forward on funding, and they need to make those successful. And so we have to think about the success of the sponsor as well. Small organizations in particular benefit from teaming significantly. They receive an ease of the burden of contracting administration. So if someone like Electricore, an omnibus contract holder, takes the primary interface with the government, then they handle the contracting issues. They have the first level of responsibility for complying with all of the regulatory issues, which are significant. You heard, I myself fielded questions from DCAA this morning on our accounting system, which I do regularly. But there are other regulatory issues you have to take into account too. Export regulations like ITAR are significant for small companies, and also issues around intellectual property. And so if a small organization is on a team with a larger organization, we have ways that we can release the burden for them for invoicing and reporting. And if the contracts are small enough, we can sometimes even deal with them in fixed price manners. So as you heard earlier, it eases the contracting on the folks as well. The other thing that happens when you team up is it provides small companies access to resources. And so large companies are very interested in gaining access to innovation. They're interested in the speed with which innovation occurs at small companies, which they may not be able to replicate in their own bureaucracies. But they can bring something to the table as well. In order to get to a DoD contract, you're going to have a significant amount of test and evaluation. And most small companies do not have the facilities or even the financing to access the level of tests that's going to have to be conducted. And so large companies often have those facilities in-house or have access to those facilities. Large companies also bring to the table subject matter experts. And so if you run into a problem that you did not encounter, often they can bring a subject matter expert to the table to close it. And the last thing that is not talked about much, but very important, is relationships. Having the right relationships to work through issues in any of the government side is very important. And so these teaming arrangements are really critical. We were asked to talk about hurdles to gaining DoD business, and I think if I step back and look at the organizations that I work with, and probably the most misunderstood piece of doing business with DoD is the time. The time constants for these contracts are very long. They can easily be 12 to 18 months between proposal and the start of work. And so large companies have the infrastructure to deal with that. Small companies, while they're waiting, have to remain viable, and they have to figure out how to keep that capacity to get the work done. And so the timing can be really an issue here. Other critical areas for doing business with DoD are screening the opportunities. DoD has a whole series of ways that they approach the marketplace, and you have to engage in that. You have to engage in that discussion if you're going to understand the requirement. DoD does not buy technology; they buy technology to service the warfighter. And so they have an absolute requirement that's driving everything that they buy. And so you have to cross the grid for them and show them how the technology is going to solve their problem. It's really important. And so doing this, communication is very important. In the areas where they're allowed to talk, you can go and talk with the program officers or the Kotars. When solicitations are on the street, that's not allowed, and so you have to go through formal discussions like question and answer periods. But that communication is very important. Reading everything that the program office you're working with puts out is very important. They do a real good job of documenting their roadmaps. And so if you read the roadmap, you'll learn a lot about what the issue is and what they think some of the solutions are. And so make sure that you're taking a look at that. And so, in conclusion, I'll just say that all organizations, small and large, should consider partnering for success in doing business with DoD.
Thank you, Deborah. I just want to turn now to our final panel member. You've heard mostly from small businesses and people who partner with businesses as well. But working with DoD, large businesses play an incredibly important role, as I'm sure you know. And Kevin Madden's the Vice President of Global Sales at Honeywell Building Systems, and I think he'll give you a perspective from a large organization which does significant work with the Department of Defense.
Thanks to Dr. Marchesi. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Number one, that title was my past title, so that's a good thing because now I'm enjoying the winters here on the East Coast. So I just moved the family from Minnesota here. So I'm now the Vice President and General Manager and Managing Director of our federal business based out of Columbia, Maryland. Just a couple things. You've heard a lot from our colleagues here today. The cycle times, in essence, in dealing with the government, contracts, DCAA auditors, TINA. These are scary things. However, you're dealing with the world's largest customer, so a great opportunity for an organization like Honeywell and organizations like yourselves. I've been with Honeywell for 28 years. I started this federal business many years ago before I cycled up through Minneapolis, and in turn have had a really good run with the business. I will tell you, in this space, we were more active in the last 6 months than we've been in the last 3 years, based on the enablers of the ESTCP programs that have been put out in the marketplace. I was talking to James earlier. One of the things that we look for as a large organization is great partnerships. And we define partnerships as shared risk, shared reward, shared accountabilities, and shared philosophies as we work with our customers and their customers. So one of the key things to drive these enablers into the marketplace is really understanding the mission. Not just technology because it's neat, but what are the missions and what are our customers trying to drive to better protect and serve their customers. So thank you for the opportunity to be here today.
Great. Thank you, Kevin. Let me just make one comment before we turn to some of the questions and open it up to floor if there's other questions. I think one thing to keep in mind is you hear what may sound like an onerous barriers to be engaged with DoD. At Amplify, it is a real customer who wants to move things ahead. And in some sense, you want to keep in mind that in going from working with the Department of Energy or other science agencies around the federal government who are doing things for the public good, that's not the mindset in the Department of Defense. We're doing things for national security and the Department of Defense mission. Now that co-aligns with the public good, but that tends to shift how the business operates and what we look for. So we're looking very concretely for value propositions. It may not be in a late-stage R&D program, something that returns money next year, but how it meets our goal or the military mission in the out years. So it tends to have a much more bottom line approach, and therefore all the processes are done to support that. There was one specific question from the audience that I'll just take directly, and then I'll open up a question to other folks on their experience. There are issues in working with innovative companies and innovators who have partners outside the U.S. That is perfectly something we want to exploit in the Department of Defense, but you have to be realistic. Working on military bases is extremely difficult, if not near impossible, for foreign nationals. It's gotten much more rigid for obvious reasons in recent years, and though in this energy space you're generally dealing with unclassified issues, the aggregation of information on energy usage and detailed profiles tend to be controlled and restricted to U.S. citizens only. So that doesn't mean that there aren't partnerships with universities overseas or companies who have foreign nationals in them, but things have to be controlled in a way that makes sure DoD's assets are protected and that they're not made vulnerable. One of the questions that I just asked people's experience there is, I think people have heard some of the difficulties and challenges, but what are your experiences in DoD trying to make it easier? Are there improvements in recent years, actions that you think make it perhaps lowering some of these bars, or is it really not changing at this point? Maybe we start all the way down to the end with you, Rodney.
Well, the overall audit process today, as I said, has changed considerably. The DCAA in particular has been subject to a report by the GAO several years ago which indicated their audit quality was not up to par. So they've sort of revamped their whole process. I think in terms of a way of improvement, if companies simply need to perhaps understand the role the DCAA has, its own mission that it has, and do the best they can to be on the ready, to think ahead and expect what the things are that will ultimately have to be audited. Because again, I agree, at the end of the day, it's all about the mission. And one of the areas of accomplishing the mission is having a smooth, efficient audit process. And if you anticipate what DCAA is all about today and try to get ready for them the best you can and following the regulations, I think that helps get to the mission a lot quicker.
Anybody else want to comment on that? Or?
I would like to, please.
Yeah.
I have actually two things to say on that front. There are programs available today that are very helpful and easier to engage in than maybe a large weapons program. And so the ESTCP is a good example of one. I've had 2 small companies and 2 large companies go into the ESTCP process. It's an opportunity to display your technology. The technology has to be ready to go into the field. It's an opportunity to have some assistance, some financial assistance for installation and testing of your technology. And probably even more important is the installations happen on military bases. And so you have real-time experience with what that takes. And then you also receive the immediate feedback from the end user about how it's working and if it's sufficient for the needs. One other thing we've seen there are other programs like that. Many of them are not as well developed. There's field exercises where you can get out and try your technology as well. So there's a couple opportunities there. But there is a trend that has been very positive, especially for technology providers, and that is the government going into a 2-stage proposal process where the first phase is just a 3 to 5 page white paper, and ESTCP uses this, ARPA-E uses this, as do others. And so you can put your idea out there, document it some, receive feedback from the agency whether or not is of interest before you invest the time and the resources, which are significant, to go through a full proposal. So watch for those opportunities.
So there are a few other questions, but if there are questions from the audience, we're happy to take them just orally. If not, some of the other questions, please think about additional questions, is what are the sort of top opportunities in terms of return on investment from the Department of Defense perspective? DoD, as I talked about earlier, balances both economic return on investment and mission support in our energy use. And that's a calculation which, I'll be honest with you, we struggle with and have not been able to quantify in a way which allows you to say, well, this is worth $1 and that's worth $5. But echoing something Deborah said earlier, I know my office and other offices reaching out do try hard to articulate the needs and to explain how they're going to assess value. Return on investment is a big part of it, but there are also the mission support. The one thing that we're seeing, if you look at the Department of Defense built infrastructure, we have probably passed the peak in military construction over the last several years. We're not building anywhere near the number of new buildings that we did a few years ago. The expectation is that that will probably continue to decline. I'll not be any more specific than that until someday we issue an FY14 budget. But given that fact and the size of our infrastructure, we exist with an aging infrastructure which we need to retrofit to make these advances we want. I don't think that's very different than the civilian world out there, so that offers an opportunity to work both ways. The question down there?
On a cost-plus contract, you have a Kotar and a contracting officer. The Kotar is asking you to continue to work harder, do more effort than what is allowed on the contract. If you want future work, it is very wise to please the Kotar. At the same time, your contract says you're only allowed to do so much. Do you have any general advice in such a situation for a small business?
You should please the Kotar. I'll be honest about that. But you should also stick within the scope of your contract. A cost-plus contract, particularly in the RDT&E world, is a recognition that costs may increase. Now, they shouldn't increase without coordination with an authority with the contracting officer. So I would urge you to have conversations when that additional work you think is worthwhile, value to the business, the technical people in the government think it's a value, that the contracting officer be brought into that discussion so that you are not put at risk. But, you know, in the end, continuation past an individual project is very dependent on the technical quality and technical success of the work. And I think everyone in DoD evaluates future investments based on past performance. That's a legitimate decision process. And so you do have to balance those things. But small companies should not be put at risk just to please a Kotar. I mean, that's not appropriate. And if there's any other experience there? Or?
Yeah, let me make a couple comments on that. Yeah, definitely please the Kotar. Usually the things that get asked are beneficial, and we sort of look at the ESTCP project in a way as a marketing or business development exercise, and additional work that goes along with it, for the most part, just improves it, and we just consider it an internal cost and not really try to be reimbursed for it. Maybe things that we would be doing anyway. Only if it came to the point where we would be asked to do something that isn't beneficial or harmful to the business, and then we might question it.
Right there, please.
Do a proposal
It's going to vary across the Department of Defense by what assets you're talking about. I mean, there is interest in rapidly adopting innovative technologies. One of the issues is, the performance. One thing that has been discussed here, which I would urge people to keep in mind, particularly in the space of energy efficiency and energy generation, is we're talking about technologies who, to be effective, have to have a significant lifetime. They rarely are beneficial in their first year, just in a bottom line approach. They're providing benefit over lifetimes. And so having proving the contention that you have something that does something that the department wants is non-trivial and has to go through a process for everyone to understand it. We can talk offline if I haven't fully answered that. There's a question to the right there. Yeah.
I understand all about DoD wanting to buy property commercial off the shelves so we can get the particular problem solved. I'm not sure I understand quite though, but the ESTCP, was that created also to have some minimal research and development aspect to it? So not in
So, yeah, the question, I'll try to repeat it, and if I get it wrong, you can shout out. The question posited that DoD in the space of our infrastructure generally wants to buy commercial off the shelf, but therefore what was the role of ESTCP given its R&D? Why was this created in some sense? And your hypothesis is correct. I mean, the Department of Defense does not want its infrastructure, as opposed to its weapon systems, to diverge greatly from the commercial world. We don't want to be supporting systems which we're the only buyer of down the road. But the unique thing about the Department of Defense, there are some security requirements and assessments, particularly with control systems, which are beyond what are the commercial world that need to be assessed. But beyond that, the size of the department and our buying power drove us to believe that a program like ESTCP was beneficial to try to accelerate what, in our view, is an extremely slow process for innovation to move through the energy pipeline. The time cycles in which energy technologies move from research to implementation, to be honest, are maybe an order of magnitude slower than in the fields of IT or biotech and things like that. And so it's just a cost calculation aggregated over time. We were willing to reach back into the late stage R&D to accelerate the potential commercialization so that we could buy it off the shelf a few years down the road. Because if we can accelerate that by years, and given the 500 installations, the 300,000 buildings, that payback is quite substantial. There really are no other organizations, there are a few, but very few other organizations which could make that statement, that their breadth of their infrastructure is so big that just advancing the commercial practices by pushing innovation benefits them enough that they'll put capital at risk. I hope that helps. Yep, please.
That was just a really great question because it went right to the heart of what we do also. HVAC, air conditioning technology, if computer technology moved as quickly as HVAC technology did, we'd still be feeding punch cards into computers and programming in 4chan. I kid you not. I mean, there's stuff out there that's 1980s technology that's pretty much standard. So it is really difficult to get things moving without a substantial demonstration, a field demonstration that shows the technology works, that's looked at by a third party, that is rigorous, that is of big enough scale that the commercial sector will take it seriously. And that takes a big investment, and for a small business, it's more of an investment that we could make. So the ESTCP allowed us to set up rigorous, large, believable demonstrations.
And I'm going to add one comment and then close this out, and people will be around taking individual questions. And there's a session later today where you can interface with my office as well as other folks in the Department of Defense. But beyond, I think, the issue that's described accurately there, our belief is there's a lot of advances to be made in the energy space which only happen when you look at things in a systems concept, and that it requires the feedback of operators, aging infrastructure, legacy equipment, and to be honest, you don't go to fruition on these new innovative concepts from a drawing board or a simulation or a laboratory. There is no way to simulate what a extremely strong, private can do to a bunch of equipment in a building. There's no way to simulate the randomness of events on the grid. And so you have to move these things out, even if the components might be commercially available. But the application in an innovative way is frozen because of the lack of the ability for people in the infrastructure world to take risk because they can't afford it. Anyway, I want to thank all our speakers here for taking the time to join us, and we're happy to answer questions later.